This is a 1991 Honda Beat, and it's a tiny rear-wheel drive two-seater Honda sports car, although it has nothing to do with the S2000 that you're probably thinking of. No, this is much different, a lot smaller and mid-engine with three-cylinder power. This was never sold here in North America, but today I'm going to review it. Before I get started, big news, this Honda Beat is currently for sale, being auctioned live on Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website. This Beat is unmodified and very special, and you now have the chance to buy it on Cars and Bids. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to head over to the live auction for this Honda Beat, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. So let's talk Honda Beat. This is a K car, which is a vehicle size classification in Japan intended to incentivize people to buy very tiny cars that fit into crowded, compact, big cities. Now, most K cars maximize their practicality. They're square-shaped hatchbacks that just barely fit the K car dimensions in order to get as much interior room as possible. But the Beat is different. That's because it is a K car sports car. The result is a tiny engine, a little three-cylinder, mid-mounted, plus two seats and not much else. And today I'm going to show you everything. First, I'll take you on a thorough tour of the Beat and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug's score. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Beat with a simple rule about this car before we get started with the video, and that is everything about the Beat is either weird and quirky or very small, and some things are both. Like, for instance, the door handle. You can see the door handle area is this circular panel which looks about the same size as a normal door handle, but the actual door handle is a tiny little rectangle within that circle that is nowhere near big enough for a hand to put in the handle. Instead, it's more like a door finger handle. You can put one or two fingers in there and open up the door. Very little, like everything else in this car. But anyway, next up, we pull in the little door handle, open up the door, and reveal the interior, which is rather bizarre, as you can see. Zebra print on the seats. All surfaces of the seats are full zebra print. This is not aftermarket. In fact, this isn't even optional. This was the way that all the Beats came from the factory, with zebra print seats. It was supposed to be a funky, fun little car, and so they wanted to make the seats funky to match, and they certainly succeeded. Same deal, by the way, with the floor mats. Also zebra print on the floor mats. And you can see there's even this little diagram sort of at the bottom center of the floor mats that says open air motoring, exclamation point, and then there's like a cartoon image of the Beat in there. Instead of saying Honda or Beat on the floor mats, you had this little cartoon graphic, which again helped make you feel like it was a fun, funky car with its little graphic and its zebra print interior. But anyway, next it is time for us to climb inside the Beat. And I have to say that fitting inside isn't really so bad. And I say that even despite the fact that, as you can see, it's a bit of a gymnastics exercise to get in here. But I can close the door, my knees are on the steering wheel, and yet I still think it isn't so bad. That's because I'm comparing this to the other K car sports cars I've reviewed. In the same era that the Beat was on sale, there were two other K sports car rivals, the AutoZam AZ1 and the Suzuki Cappuccino. Together with the Beat, they made up the ABC cars, the AZ1, the Beat, and the Cappuccino, ABC, and they were the K car sports cars. This is the last one of those that I still have to review, and it is a little bigger in this interior than its rivals. Now, it's worth pointing out that the K car sports car trend died off after these cars. They came out in the early 90s, and then Japan went into a long economic recession, and people weren't buying fun cars like this, so they all went off the market, and more K car sports cars didn't show up for years until like the late 90s, early 2000s with the Daihatsu Copen, and now there's a modern version of the Beat on sale called the Honda S660, which looks very cool and sort of continues the theme of this car into the modern era. But the point of all of these these vehicles, all of them, is that they fit into this K-car size classification in Japan, which is a governmental regulatory classification designed to incentivize people to buy really small cars. Now, if you're in Japan, you can still buy larger cars, but there are some tax incentives and other benefits for buying these tiny little K-cars, and they are small. This one is only 129.7 inches long, which is 4.5 feet shorter than a Honda Accord. And not a modern Honda Accord. It was 4.5 feet shorter than a Honda Accord of its era. It is that tiny, incredibly small car. It only weighs 1,675 pounds, the Honda Beat. So it's really small, short, narrow, and lightweight. A just minuscule little car. But anyway, next up, let's go on to some other quirks and features of this interior. In between the seats, between the backrests, you have this panel here, which is a center storage area. You can open it up and see there's little slots in there, I think for cassette tapes or mini discs, I'm not exactly sure, but you could stick musical things in there if you chose the radio option in the Beat. It was optional. Now, interestingly, in the Beat, there were some other clever storage compartments in this interior. For instance, move up the passenger seat, move it forward, and you can see this little storage compartment behind the passenger seat, sort of hidden out of place, and it locks like a glove box would, so you could put your valuables back here and no one will find them, and you can lock it even if they do. Now, you do have a glove box in this car, but it's smaller than usual. Over on the passenger side of the dashboard, in the normal spot, but about half the size of a normal glove box, and that's because it shares this space with the dome light. That's what you can see here. There's no dome or ceiling on which to mount the dome light, so in the Beat they've mounted it on the passenger side of the dashboard, and it steals space from the glove box, which isn't a trade-off most automakers have to make, dome light or glove box, but they did it here. Fortunately, you got that extra glove box behind the passenger seat. Now, interestingly, as relatively compromised and little tiny as this car is, it does have some nice features. For instance, power windows. You can see the window switches here. Power windows, obviously press them, they go up or down, which is nice. This car also had air conditioning from the factory. You can see the AC button here, not working at the moment, but it had AC, which is kind of a surprise in a car this size from Japan, from this era. Not a lot of cars did, but this one did. Now, next up, another interesting quirk in this interior, kind of cool to see, is the gauge cluster, which is mounted on top of the steering column, as you can see. Instead of integrated into the dashboard like most cars, it's mounted there, sort of like a motorcycle almost to an extent. It kind of has a charming and cool look to it, and I like to see it there. Now, the tachometer is directly in the middle, because of course it is. If you want to take your Beat out on the racetrack, that's all you'll care about. The tag is in the middle, and red line is 8,500 RPM, which is pretty impressive. The tag goes all the way to 10,000 RPM, which is really impressive. And you look at that, you think this is a really serious sports car until you look at the speedometer, which only goes up to 140 kilometers per hour, or roughly 87 miles per hour. That's as fast as the speedometer even indicates. And of course, this car doesn't even go that fast. Apparently, it was limited to 83 miles an hour from the factory, but some Beat owners, I was reading online, have removed the limiter and gotten it up to 100 miles an hour, which frankly seems terrifying in a vehicle like this, but apparently it's possible. Now, the real surprise here is that this car is so relatively slow considering the M-Track system. Yes, this car has M-Track, and when you open up the door, you see on the door sill not Honda or Beat, instead it says M-Track, which apparently stood for Multi-Throttle Responsive Engine Control. Now, obviously, I don't know what this means. Most people have probably forgotten. It was something they tried to market like 30 years ago that nobody cares about anymore, but they were really serious about it at the time, serious enough to put it in the door sills instead of this car's actual name, which is kind of funny. There's even this little decal on the door sill, which I assume the owner added to be proud of his M-Track system. This car had the M-Track. So, given that this car has that M-Track system, let's take a look back here and see what we got. Now, this car is mid-engine, just like the AutoZam AZ1 mid-engine K-car, which upped the cool factor even more. Of course, the access the engine back here, you stick in the key, twist it, and lift up this rear compartment. Now, to get it to stay in place, you can see it won't stay unless you put on this prop here, you stick it in, and then your rear compartment is open, and you can see the M M-Track. Although you can't really see that much of it. It's kind of hidden back there in the middle of this car. But I'll tell you, it's a 3-cylinder, about 650 cc, 0.6, 0.7 liter 3-cylinder, and it only made about 63 horsepower when it was new. Not especially powerful, even with the M-Track benefit. Now, the reason for this tiny engine in this car is those K-car regulations. It wasn't just based on vehicle size, it was also power and engine size, and so to conform to the regs, had to have this tiny engine, and so it does. Now, you can see this engine also shares this rear compartment with the battery, for one thing. The battery is mounted over on the side. They did that to balance out the engine, which is mounted over on the other side. This car's engine is so tiny that weight balance can be transferred by just moving the battery over, and kind of counters out the engine's weight on the left side. Kind of interesting to see that, but that's why the battery is placed in that exact spot. Now, it's unfortunate the battery is there to an extent because it steals your cargo space, and you don't have much to begin with. This is your cargo area, carpeted back here behind the engine, really, really tiny, not a lot of room for basically anything, but that's the cargo space in the Honda Beat. Now, carrying on this very tiny theme, like the cargo area and basically everything else in this car, take a look at the air intakes on the side. These are also pretty much the smallest air intakes I've ever seen for a mid-engine car to get air to the powertrain. They are so little, but it's a tiny engine and that's all it needed. And how about these little openings on the engine lid? These are for heat dissipation for the engine, and again, incredibly tiny. Some of the smallest I have ever seen, but again, tiny car, tiny engine, everything is scaled down, just doesn't need any more than that. Now, one interesting thing back here is you can see the roof does not intrude on this compartment. You can see the compartment is completely separate from the roof when it's down. They're two different things, and so you don't get the roof stealing storage space or anything else from this car. And that's kind of a surprise given how tiny this car is. A lot of larger convertibles have the roof stealing storage space, but not here. Now, the roof operation in this car is quite simple. It's a manual top, as you might imagine, and to put it up, you just lift it up. You lift it into place, and then there's two latches on the windshield. You latch both of them, and then the top is up. Although you will notice that even with the roof up, the rear window isn't up, and that's because it has to be zipped separately. You have a zipper going across the entire rear window. You just zip it, and then your rear window is in place too, and that's the top operation in this car. And of course, if you want to put the top down, you just do everything in the opposite direction. First, unzip the rear window. You got to unzip the whole thing all the way around to remove slack in the rear window. Then unlatch the top at the top of the windshield, and then just manually push it down, and then the roof is down and out of place. A very easy top to use, although that whole zipper rear window thing adds a little bit of complication because you have to reach all the way across, but it's still pretty easy and pretty simple to put the top up and down in the Beat. But now you're probably wondering about the front of this car, because most mid-engine cars that don't have cargo space in the back have some cargo space in the front. So does the Honda Beat? Well, let's find out. To open this front panel, this front compartment, there's a little latch in the driver footwell, pretty obvious. You pull that and it pops open, and then you lift it open from here, and it's quite easy to do. Again, this won't stay up in place unless you put on the prop, so you do that, and then you can take a look inside this front compartment, and you quickly discover, no, there is no more storage space in here. Now, you do have a spare tire in here, and theoretically you could stick something inside the spare if you really had to store it, but mostly it's just mechanical components and that tire, not really extra storage in here. As you can probably gather, the Beat is not an especially practical car. Now, I will say that with this front compartment up, you do get a pretty cool look at the front tires and just how tiny they are. Incredibly narrow, as you can see through this opening. Just really small little tires, not what you'd expect on a sports car, if you can call this that. But they're also just small generally. These are 13-inch wheels, just really small. Like I said, everything on this car is basically scaled down compared to every other car. Now, the wheel wheels themselves are kind of interesting. These are the factory wheels for this car, which is very unusual because most Japanese imported cars have at some point in their life had wheels swapped out. Modifying tuning cars, very popular in Japan, even more than in the States. And so you'd think the wheels would be lost by now, but they're not. These are the factory wheels. This is how it looked. They're very reminiscent of Porsche's phone dial wheels on 944s and some other models. They look a lot like that, and they come from a similar era, so I wonder if that's kind of what Honda was going for. One interesting thing, you can see one of the circles in the wheel is sort of a cutout on the end to make room for the valve stem. Just a little quirk of the Honda Beat multi-circle wheels. But anyway, on the subject of how this car looks, I want to talk about the design because there are some interesting things about it, specifically the fact that the Beat was designed by Pininfarina, the legendary Italian designers. They were designing Ferraris back at this time, and they also did the Honda Beat. Now, Pininfarina and Honda had teamed up before on a concept car called the HPX in the early 1980s from Honda, and then they teamed up again for this, the Honda Beat road car, and this is a Pininfarina design. I'm not necessarily sure if I would call it beautiful, but it is certainly distinctive and head-turning and cool, and it definitely doesn't look like other Honda models of its day. It has some Pininfarina to the look. Now, one especially distinctive element of this car's design is where the wheels and tires are placed. You can see they're at the very corners of this car, very far forward, no overhang in front. Same deal in back, very far in back, no overhang. And I suspect this was done intentionally in order to maximize room for everything else in between the wheels. So you have your passenger compartment here, obviously your mechanicals, and by pulling the wheels as far out as you possibly could, it gave you a fighting chance of being able to fit everything in this car, which obviously worked out. Now, a few more interesting Beat facts for you. This car was made from 1991 through 1995-96 basically, and they sold around 34,000 Beats during that time, but the vast majority came early. This Beat is a 91, and so were 2/3 of all of the Beat models. Even though production ran for 5 or 6 years, 2/3 came in the first year. Now, the big reason for that is, of course, that Japanese economic recession that I mentioned. People really weren't buying cars like this in large numbers, and so early 90s it made sense, and then it started to make less and less sense. But also, obviously, people had bought the car, they thought it was cool, they went and got one, and then demand kind of slowed down. But the vast majority of Beat models you will find are 1991s like this one. And so, those are the quirks and features of the Honda Beat. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Honda Beat. I have always wanted to drive one of these cars ever since I saw it for the very first time in Automobile magazine when I was a kid, when it was new. And I was always wondering, how can I get one of those? What do I have to do? And the answer, of course, is they weren't legal to be imported. But now that they're 25 years old, these are legal to be imported, and this one is here, and it's titled here. Now, I want to mention the Beats were all manual transmissions. Some of the Cappuccinos had an automatic, but all the Beats were manual, and same with the AZ1. Manual is just more common then, and these little cars, just what they did. Now, when you get into this car, it's very interesting compared to the Cappuccino and the AZ1. They're just a little different. The Cappuccino and the AZ1 to me are kind of more sporty sports car type feeling vehicles. This, not really quite as much for a couple reasons. Number one, it's bigger in here, and I don't want to say it's comfortable or it's like a grand tourer, but it certainly has more space to kind of roam around. It was obviously designed to be a little bit more comfortable and a little less like focused, crazy sports car with all sorts of compromises. That wasn't really how this worked. Now, the other thing that I've noticed about this car, driving it around, that's kind of interesting to me is it doesn't quite drive as well as the Cappuccino and the AZ1. Both of those cars were really felt like sports cars. You turn the wheel and instantaneously the car switches direction, blah, blah, blah. This has, it's just not quite as sporty or quite as like focused and precise as those cars. One of the issues is, to me, it feels very light in front. I'm actually kind of surprised by it. You turn the wheel and you have that sort of rear heaviness, front lightness that makes you a little uneasy. And if this car had a lot more power, I suspect that would be something that would kind of be a little scary in terms of driving it. It almost feels like the Renault Sport Clio V6 that's mid-engine. That car is known to be dangerous. This almost feels like that. It's a little better balanced, and obviously it's less power, so you can't get into as much trouble, but it's a similar kind of idea in the Beat. But I will say, you know, pros and cons, but obviously the big benefit is that you have more space, so you can more aptly use this vehicle. I also personally think the Beat is probably the best looking of the AZ1 Cappuccino Beat crowd. The Cappuccino was cool, but it almost looked like a scaled down Miata. The AZ1 was not beautiful, but it had the cool doors. This is a neat looking car. I think it's a really cool head turning. Someone came up to me while I was filming and said, hey, is that an MR2? It has sort of that cool mid-engine look to it. Now, I do want to point out, this car is not fast. It does feel relatively fast, like the other K-car sports cars did, because it's so low and so little, and you hear a lot of powertrain behind you, so you kind of get the feeling like you're going fast. But this is not an especially fast car, and that's clear the moment you step on the throttle. You're just not going anywhere with incredible speed. What you are getting, though, is kind of this cool experience, this tiny little unique car that nobody else is going to have. Mid-engine construction, obviously Honda reliability. The Beats do seem to hold up a little better than the AZ1s and the Cappuccinos. You see more of these, and you see more in good shape like this one. But here we go. I'm going to ring it out right here. All right. So first, top of first. Let's go ring out second. Flooring it, 6,000, 7,000, 8. I mean, it's slow. It's just slow. That was the whole thing about the K cars. They couldn't be fast. They were limited to 63 horsepower. You couldn't really go at it with one of these things in order to fit into the K car dimensions. But there were all sorts of benefits to getting a K car, like you didn't have to apply, you didn't have to prove that you had a parking space, which you do in Japan, and there were tax benefits and insurance benefits. And so, you know, there were a lot of reasons to make a K-car sports car before the economy slowed down in Japan. Overall, I gotta say, this is a cool car. Like I said, not quite as focused or as sports car-y as the Cappuccino and the AZ1. In fact, I'm surprised just how different it is. I was expecting them all to feel about the same, but they don't really. There's different character between the three, even though they all have 63 horsepower 3-cylinders. This one is probably the one that I would get, if I'm being totally honest, simply because I fit and because I like how it looks the best. The AZ1 is definitely the coolest, and in my opinion, the AZ1 drives the best. Cappuccino is definitely the second best drive. This has more of kind of a cruiser feel, but I do like it, I do enjoy it, I do fit in it, and you got Honda reliability and Pininfarina design, which is a pretty cool combo. And so that's the Honda Beat. I have always wanted to check this car out ever since I first heard about it when I was a kid, back when it was new, and I'm thrilled that I finally had the chance to spend the day with it. It's not fast, it's not big or exotic, but it is special, to me anyway, and you can buy this one on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the Beat a Doug score. And the Doug score is here, 44 out of 100, which places the Beat here against some relevant cars. The Beat finishes last among the ABC K cars, losing to the AZ1 and Cappuccino, but the Beat has a higher daily score than both of those. Reviewing all three of these cars, I'm surprised to discover they're actually quite different. The Beat is the most comfortable, the largest inside, and the most usable, but the least engaging to drive. But it's still very weird, very head-turning, and very cool.